your efforts and continue. Okay. Thank you for all your efforts and your expertise in getting this virtual program off the ground this evening. And thanks to all of you who have taken the time, shown an interest to Zoom with us. Our program is entitled Godspeed, Jann Glove, and it's been especially prepared for you to commemorate the 60th anniversary of Jann Glove's first historic flight. It's also a wee bit of a public confession of a lifelong infatuation that I've had with this American hero. You see, when I was growing up, it was like a big thing. All the other girls that were close to my age were gaga over movie stars and musicians, and not so much me. I just loved astronauts, and especially this one in particular, Jann Glove. And boy, did it bother my sister when I would cut out pictures of Jann Glove and pin them up all over her pictures of the Beatles and the other icons that she was involved in. So tonight we're going to talk about Jann Glove. In 13 days, it will have been 60 years since Scott Carpenter, the backup astronaut for Jann Glove's flight, that astronaut, Scott Carpenter, said, "Godspeed, Jann Glove." And those words were spoken in the moments after the Atlas engine started, before the rocket actually took off from the launch pad. Hundreds of thousands of people watching their TVs and listening to their radios heard those words spoken. But Jann Glove himself did not hear it because of some temporary glitch in the frequency settings on their radios. But didn't seem to matter, because from that launch forward, every single American manned flight that has left the planet has been sent on its way with that short and simple, nonpartisan, non-political, non-denominational, impromptu prayer, always being said. Even the most recent commercial flights have sent our astronauts off with a Godspeed, whatever the astronaut's name is. Interesting fact. So let's talk about where it all began. When it began was July 18th, 1921. I think most people would get this question wrong. Where is the birthplace of Jann Glove? I think most people are going to say not where he's born. He's actually born in Cambridge, Ohio. But by the time he's 2, his family actually moves just a skip and a hop to the west and to a town called New Concord. New Concord is where Jann Glove always talked about as being his hometown. He really embraced New Concord. New Concord certainly embraced him. Check out this sign here. Even before he's a Mercury astronaut, even when he's a flight space candidate, they'd already got this cool sign up for him. Can you imagine how great that would make you feel? Once he does make his historic flight, they erect a bigger, better, more durable sign. It's also in New Concord that you'll find the John and Annie Glenn Museum. My friend, who I know is watching tonight, Grandma Beaver, and I went to the John and Annie Glenn Museum the 3rd week of October. It was terrific. It's not a big museum. It's totally void of all the high-tech gadgets and gizmos that you see in big museums, but it's chock full of authentic memorabilia. And most importantly, the costumed interpreters that gave the tours around the house, they were exceptional. They were so knowledgeable and so passionate about the Jann Glove story. You really should go here sometime. It's not open again until May 1st, closed for these cold winter months. And GPS says it's 2 hours and 9 minutes to the south of Cleveland. Very easy to find. Okay, let's see here. Push this. There they are, pictures of little Jann Glove, with the one in the upper left-hand side, of course, being the most famous one, because at how old do you think he is? Maybe 18 months? He's pointing upward to where he eventually wants to go. This picture I've seen a million times. Any pictures you see of John Glenn's youth, you're going to see that. He was named John Herschel Glenn Jr. after his dad, who he very often pointed out as being the most influential person in his life. To avoid the confusion of having two people in the same house named the same thing, John Glenn Jr. was called Bud from the get-go. He was the very first astronaut born in the state of Ohio. But check this picture out. Look at how many other astronauts have been born in Ohio. And this picture here, this NASA poster, I don't know, it's probably at least 10 years old by now. So there's, I'm sure, more astronauts been added. You can see not only John Glenn here, but you can also see up right under the O and where it says Ohio there, you'll see Neil Armstrong, first man to walk on the moon. And both John Glenn and Neil Armstrong often re-quoted the quote I'm going to post here that was actually said by Wilbur Wright. If I were giving a young man advice as to how he might succeed in life, I would say to him, pick out a good father and mother and begin life in Ohio. So if you're from Ohio, you'd be pretty proud of all these astronauts, you would think, but there's always somebody out there that's just a little bit jealous that you have so much more than they do. And so they put things like this on social media, which is actually kind of funny. 24 astronauts were born in Ohio. What is it about your state that makes people want to flee the Earth? Think about that a while. If I could describe John Glenn using just one adjective, that adjective would be patriotic. Patriotic. The seeds of patriotism were planted in little John Glenn, little Bud, from the get-go. His family was encouraged to stand along, waving flags whenever military parades, military veterans would go by. And likewise, they would go to cemeteries and put flowers by the flags, by the grave sites of fallen soldiers. John Glenn's dad himself was a veteran of World War I, and he was often asked to play taps at the cemetery for military funerals. And when he was asked to play taps, he would give Bud, young John, the duty of playing echo taps somewhere off in the distance. Now that's, I think, would really warm your heart. It's also his dad that recognizes Bud's passion for flying. So one day, here's how it happens. One day they're driving to Cambridge, and I think his dad, who was a plumber, had some job in Cambridge, but they're driving to Cambridge, and Dad sees off in the field, he sees a biplane that is advertising sightseeing rides for a reasonable price. And this has really where timing comes in as everything, because it's about 3 months before the Great Depression. If it had been after the Great Depression started, John Glenn wouldn't have had this first flight. But Dad asked John if he wants to go up. And of course he said, I do. So the two of them scrunched together in the passenger seat in this plane, open cockpit. They're scrunched in there. They get a bird's eye view of the area, and John Glenn loves it. And it only increases his interest in aviation. And it also gives him the idea that, I'm going to spend more of my spare time making little airplanes out of balsa wood. And you can see some of those hanging up in that John and Annie Glenn museum I talked about. This is called the Waco aircraft, made in Troy, Ohio, over near Dayton. Besides spending free time making balsa wood airplanes, John Glenn liked to go camping. That makes sense, because we all know that John Glenn was a Boy Scout, right? Wrong. Even though we hear numerous times in that great movie, The Right Stuff, they keep referring to him as a Boy Scout. They're really referring to him as a Boy Scout because Boy Scout in the way of meaning a do-gooder, someone that's always, being nice and such. He wasn't a card-holding member of the Boy Scouts of America. So let's just consider him the most famous Boy Scout that never was. As an adult, he was one of the, maybe the lead promoter of the Boy Scout organization. This is a poster from 1960, early 1960s. And I think I heard some person, or I saw some reference to the young man next to John Glenn being his son David, but I couldn't refine that to verify it. But yeah, he's on this recruiting poster, and he goes on in 1965 to receive Scouting's highest award for service to adults, and that's the Silver Buffalo Award. The thing that's interesting before we leave this whole idea of Boy Scouts is check out the points of the Boy Scout law. Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Can you think of anyone in your lifespan that more closely has their life aligned with the points of the Scout law than John Glenn did? I don't think I can think of anybody that even comes close to that. Well, maybe my husband, and certainly Doc Unger, but other than that, I don't think so. Okay, once in the summer, this is a picture of John Glenn in his yearbook, how it appeared in the yearbook. This was long before senior pictures had the coat over the shoulder, sitting on a tractor with your dog in a Ohio State sweatshirt type picture. These were what everybody's senior pictures look like for all you young people that might be listening in tonight. From this, we know that he was a class officer, he was class president, he was involved in a lot of sports. He wasn't all that enthused about sports. He did a lot of singing, he especially liked barbershop quartets. He was in the marching band and the orchestra, did a lot of things. In the summer, he was a camp counselor, and after graduation, he goes to Muskingum College, which is also located in New Concord, Ohio. In fact, before John Glenn came along, all New Concord had going for it was the college, but then John Glenn came along and put it on some maps, put New Concord on a few maps. Now, John Glenn goes to college. He really wants to become a pilot, but during the Great Depression, like so many families, John Glenn's family struggled. They're still struggling to recover when John is of age now, and they don't have a lot of money, and they certainly have no extra money for flying lessons. So one day, I think I need a drink here. One day, John Glenn notices on the bulletin board in the physics department, he sees a flyer on the bulletin board. And this is in his memoirs. And he doesn't suggest that this is divine intervention. He actually says, I knew it was placed there by heaven. This flyer that he's looking at, he read a couple of times. It was advertising for the civilian pilot training program. It was a program where the government would pay you, or would pay for your ground school and your flight instruction, your flying lessons, and eventually successful trainees would, if they could do everything right, they would get their private pilot's license. John Glenn was super excited about this. He applies, he's accepted. He drives 3 days a week to New Philadelphia Airport and gets his training. And by his 21st birthday, he has his private pilot license. I really read a lot more about the civilian pilot training manual, the civilian pilot training program. They had it in a lot of different countries. Here in America, we actually ended up training 435,165 people, including a lot of women and African Americans who were taught to fly under the civilian pilot training program. So interesting way to get in. Now, so he's still a young man. He's still considered a kid in my book. But then all of a sudden, his childhood ends rather abruptly once war is declared. But we're not going to talk about the war right now. Right now, I want to talk about what I think is the most endearing aspect of John Glenn's life, his love for a hometown girl named Annie Castor. They had a fairy tale romance. It was so magical. It had all the earmarks of a Disney romance. His family, John Glenn's family and Annie Castor's family, told them that they met as toddlers in a playpen. And I thought I better include a picture of a playpen because, playpens, I think were banned about 35 years ago. They were great things. I thought you could use a play. It was meant to protect your child while you were doing other important things like cleaning and cooking and going to the bathroom and stuff like that. And so you could have a lot of kids corralled, all your children, maybe the neighbor's kids kept out of the way, but kind of safe. But again, those have been long since banned. So the reason that John and Annie were in the playpen together is because the families belong to something called the Twice Five Club. It sounds like an informal social club where a couple times a month they would meet to eat and chat and play cards and so on and so forth. So John and Annie Glenn know each other very early in life, and throughout all their life, they're together. By the time they are in junior high, they're already an item. By the time they're in high school, they're already talking about marriage, even running away to get married, but they don't. They're not part of the rush to the altar wave that swept across the country once World War II was declared. They actually agree to get engaged because John Glenn knew that only bachelors were going to be eligible for cadet flight training, and he wanted to make sure that he was eligible for that. He proposes to Annie, gives her a ring that costs $125, and he said periodically throughout his life, he wants to buy Annie a bigger diamond. And she said, no, I just really like the one you gave me first. That just makes me so happy inside. And they finally get married on April 6, 1943. The deal was as soon as John got his aviator wings that they would get married. And so they do. And they stay together. Oh, I forgot to tell you that see that just popped up? That's the cake topper from their wedding cake, which is, of course, at the John and Annie Glenn Museum, also with her bridal gown and all sorts of other cool things from the wedding. They're together through better or worse, through thick or through thin, and sickness and health, despite the odds. I mean, even in the regular everyday world, it would be amazing to have a couple together this long. But in the NASA culture, it was even more rare, where the divorce rate was 77% in the early Mercury, Gemini, Apollo astronauts. So they're together for a long time. You know how long they're together? An incredibly long 73.75 years. You can read about their amazing love story in a book that came out in 2020, late 2020, called The Last American Hero. Very, very good. In that book, you'll learn that John Glenn is incredibly mild-mannered unless you pick on his wife. And it goes on to say, the struggles that Annie had with her stuttering, he always overlooked it and protected her from other people. She overcomes this disability, goes on to become an advocate for people with speech disorders. And there's even a special room in the museum that is all about her contributions to society, trying to get other people to have the courage to learn how to not stutter. It was very interesting. Also in the book, the thing I think I like the most learning from that book is a special little cryptic message that John and Annie shared whenever it was about time for John to go on another one of his numerous dangerous missions. He would simply say, "Don't worry, Annie. Remember, I'm only going down to the corner store to buy a pack of gum." And she would answer, "Don't be long." Isn't that nice? Now, I know they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but when I see this picture of a devoted wife, Annie, touching the flag-draped casket of her husband, I can only think of 5 words that it says: "Till death do us part." And again, what a wonderful love story. If you need to go get a tissue, that would be a really good time. Okay. John Glenn dies on December 8th, 2016. We're going to talk about that quite a bit later. He dies on December 8th, 2016, but he's not buried for several months. And this is at Annie's request. He's not buried and interred at Arlington National Cemetery until April 6th of 2017. Why that date? Remember that April 6th date? It's their 74th wedding anniversary. So 74th wedding anniversary. Annie was the center, the real center of John Glenn's universe. And Annie herself was one of the United States early, one of the first celebrity COVID victims back in May of 2020. Now let's go back and talk about John Glenn's military service, which is extensive. It goes on, he's in the military for 23 years. He felt compelled to enlist as soon as he hears FDR, "This day shall live in infamy" speech. So he and his friend go off to Zanesville. They go off to Zanesville and they enlist in the Army Air Corps. He does not return to college. He is waiting for his orders to come and he thinks they're going to come soon. So he gets a job plowing fields and he waits. He waits for a couple of weeks and then he waits for a couple months. At the end of the third month, he returns to Zanesville and this time he goes to the Navy recruiter. He says, "I've got my private pilot license. I've got 200 hours worth of flight time." And they say, "Okay, we'll take you." And he takes the oath. And within 2 weeks, he's on a train off to basic training. Here's this map here. I would guess from watching Hollywood movies, I felt that the combat fighters might take a couple training flights and they'd be sent off to war, but that was definitely not the case. And in his memoirs, in his autobiography, John Glenn states that they were told they were have to undergo 18 months worth of training before they would be sent off to war. And so this map, all these stars you see are places that he ends up going. So he's leaving from New Concord and off he goes to Iowa City, and that's where he takes his basic training and his officer candidate school. And that's for 3 months. Then he goes down to Olathe, Kansas, and this is where he gets his advanced flight training. And no, take that back. That's his primary flight training is in Olathe, Kansas. But what's really cool, this is a brand new facility. He said the paint wasn't even dry. The sound system wasn't in. And so they didn't have anybody playing reveille and taps and call to assembly. And guess who gets to do that? The guy that played the trumpet, the echo taps for his dad when he was just a young man. He's in Olathe, Kansas for 3 months, and then he's sent down to the Center of Naval Air Stations, which is down in Corpus Christi, Texas. That's where he gets his advanced flight training. He's there for 6 months. Near the end of the 6-month time period, the cadets, they're given the option of, do they want to be commissioned as officers in the Navy or officers in the Marines? And John Glenn chose the Marines because he really was interested in the heroic history of the Marines. So he's commissioned as an officer. He gets his naval aviator, his aviator wings, and off he goes as fast as he can get there back to New Concord and marries the love of his life. They have this exciting honeymoon, I'm sure it was, for 3 days in Columbus, Ohio. And then off they go to his station over in Cherry Hill, North Carolina. Just as they're getting unpacked, it's announced that there's too many pilots, not enough planes. And so at the end of 3 weeks, they are sent to, he's got Annie with him now. They go all the way across the country to San Diego, to Fort Kearny. And there he's flying, and he's flying DC-3s, and he doesn't want to fly some clunky transport plane. He wants to fly a sleek fighter. So this is kind of like one of the first times that he makes things happen. My grandpa always said, God helps those who help themselves. And in this instance, he knows that there's some sleek fighters around, and so he goes over and talks to the squadron commander, and but he forgot to go through the chain of command, which is a big no-no in the military. So he gets in a little bit of trouble, but it all works out because he gets sent to nearby El Centro, California, and he starts learning how to fly a Corsair, which at that time was considered the fiercest of the planes before any of the jet-propelled planes were around. While he's in El Centro, something amazing happens. He gets to meet his childhood hero, Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh is actually had been hired by the company that made the Corsairs, the manufacturer of the Corsairs, and he's being sent to all these different places in the United States to do morale boosting and talking up this particular plane. From El Centro, the next place he goes is to the Hawaiian Islands, and he's there for a month. It is mid-October of 1944 before Glenn gets to the Marshall Islands and it flies in his first combat mission. But even so, he ends up flying in 59 combat missions in World War II. And if you want to know more about all the aircraft he learned to fly in and all the ins and outs of each and every one of the missions that he was in, I do suggest you take a look at his memoir, because it's very detailed, and who could tell better about your war years than you yourself. In between World War II and the Korean War, he does a lot of studying. He's studying for all those college. He didn't complete college, so he's taking college courses. He's also taking courses in celestial navigation, in meteorology, aerodynamics, and he's also getting a lot more flight training. He's getting a lot more flight training. He becomes very proficient. He's asked to be an instructor, and then he's asked to be an instructor of the instructors. He's really, really starting to shine. And then along comes the Korean conflict, and he steps forward and volunteers to go to Korea. And it's in the Korean War that he actually really shines. He comes to the forefront flying the new F-86 Sabres, and you can see on his front of his airplane there, it doesn't have a naked lady painted on it. It has the names of his wife, Annie, and their two children, Lynn and John David. Not only was he flying high-speed aircraft in the Korean War, the latest and the greatest, but he also was flying alongside baseball's great Ted Williams. Ted Williams was in the reserves and had been called back to the Korean War and was actually John Glenn's wingman, and they remain friends throughout life. You'll see Ted Williams again here a little further in the program. John Glenn was a highly decorated serviceman. Here you see him getting another Distinguished Flying Medal. He actually gets 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 2 in World War II, 2 in Korea, and on down the line, he gets, within 15 years, he gets 2 more, so stand by. He flew between World War II and Korea. He flew in 150 successful missions. But you're probably wondering, was it really that dangerous for him? Did he ever get hit by enemy fire? Did he ever crash? Well, he never lost a plane. He never ejected, and he was struck by enemy fire 5 times in World War II and 7 times in Korea. And it wasn't just little BB gun type shells. He had some real serious damage done to his planes. Several times there was more than 250 holes in the aircraft that he brought down, and a couple times that those holes were even big enough to put his head through. So it wasn't an easy go for this man. Once the Korean War is over, he becomes a test pilot. And you can almost hear Annie saying, I am so scared. And John Glenn saying, don't worry, Annie. I'm only going to the corner store to buy a pack of gum. And she has to say, don't be long. Being a test pilot is so much more dangerous than being a combat flyer. The statistic was that 1/4 of all test pilots were going to die in a fiery crash of some sort. But this was what John Glenn liked. He loved flying the new airplanes and trying to see how far he can push the envelope. But the one thing that he really didn't like when it came to be his time in the rotation of sitting at the desk and going over all the data and looking at differential equations and looking at decompression charts and moving decimal points around. He really didn't like that at all. And so, God helps those who help themselves, he comes up with this plan, this ridiculous plan. Instead of testing this flight in increments, all these little tests, why don't we just have one extensive flight? And why doesn't it be flown by me, John Glenn? And that idea was approved. And again, there's my gum to remind you, tell you about what Annie must have been thinking. On July 16th, 1957, that flight takes place, and John Glenn ends up setting the transcontinental speed record, 726 miles per hour. And for the first time, we start seeing his face turn up in newspapers. A lot of the newspapers, he's right on the front page. That was when newspapers had more than just a front page. So he's being seen, he's being recognized, he's becoming a celebrity. He's being recognized to the point where somebody saw him that was working with the folks at Name That Tune, and he's invited to be a guest celebrity on Name That Tune. This gets widespread coverage because there's only 3 stations back then. He's singing with a little boy there that I guess became a star, Eddie Hodges. But again, John was really into music, and they ended up winning the first prize, which was $25,000. They split the money, and John uses some of that money later on to send his kids through college. He has a taste of celebrity, but he has no idea how 2 years later that celebrity status will skyrocket exponentially when he becomes one of the first 7 of the Mercury astronauts. He's the only one of the spacemen that you see there that isn't nervous and tongue-tied because he had that little brush with celebrity beforehand. The right stuff. These are the 7 Mercury astronauts. We had to memorize their names in 3rd grade, and I remember them still now. I learned them so much quicker than I learned the multiplication tables. I remember Shepard, Grissom, Glenn, Farrar, Carpenter, Cooper, Slayton. We had to learn them and know them because it was important. It was part of being an American. Every one of these 7 men had the right stuff. Every one of you men that you see here was in top mental and physical condition. They had well above average IQs. They had the right stuff. And they all seemed to like fast cars, which isn't a bad thing. And except for John Glenn, who might have liked fast cars, but he drove a kind of a clunky looking car like that because he had a family. John Glenn was immensely popular. He was just enormously popular with the public. All of these astronauts are immediately admired because of the media coverage. Everybody knows who they are. They are admired, but John Glenn was adored. In fact, as one author put it, John Glenn was the gold standard by which the other astronauts were measured. Even though he was popular with the public, again, from the right stuff, you probably remember he wasn't too popular with the other astronauts, mostly because John Glenn wasn't really fitting with the flyboy macho image that the other astronauts, most of the other astronauts were into womanizing and carousing and bar hopping. And that just wasn't John Glenn. John Glenn taught Sunday school. He was a man of great faith. And he was a very dedicated father. And we already mentioned what a dedicated husband that he was. He was a family man, and he stuck to that. He didn't have long to wait. Oh, I should tell you this, that it was because he was so different than the other astronauts, and he was the do-gooder, the Boy Scout, that all through his life, he felt that was the reason that he wasn't named to be the first to go into outer space. He was definitely the fan favorite with the media, but the astronauts were called back in December of 1960 to vote for who they felt should be the first astronaut to go to space. And that peer vote was what Glenn felt kept him from being the first man in space. Instead, we had Alan Shepard go first. Gus Grissom was second. Glenn was their backup. But again, before a year passes, John Glenn is the one that is pointed to be the first man from America to orbit the Earth. And that's a good thing, because by then space mania had struck and all eyes are on Glenn with the keenest of interest. Here you see John Glenn getting into a space capsule, Friendship 7. And actually, you don't get into it, you put it on. That was the quote that the astronauts would frequently say. These people you see standing around the space capsule are the members of the capsule insertion crew, because it's really tight quarters in there. You really need some help stuffing them in there. The size of the Mercury space capsule was half of a Volkswagen Beetle. Should mention the name Friendship 7. The astronauts were given the opportunity to name their space capsules in the early years, and John Glenn let his children pick the name of his space capsule. Here you see lots and lots of kids walking around with chairs. You know where they're going? They are going to the high school, because the high school is where the TV is, that the only TV is that they can see the launch of John Glenn on this particular day. Now, this is when television is still in its infancy. Not every family had a television. A lot of, if you had a television, you might have one television. Schools didn't have like 6 televisions in their hallways even, and every television in every classroom. That was something that I really objected to, because when the flight had been delayed for over a dozen times, and when I learned that I was going to be in a gymnasium with like 500 to 1,000 kids watching a TV set, I said, you know, I want to see it. I want to see it better. So I am going to stay home from school. I played hooky on that particular day. There were no big screens, of course. Look, here's the President of the United States and his wife, and there's LBJ right there. And look at how tiny that television is that they're watching this historic event. It's probably a fraction of the size of the televisions that we watch now, maybe like an 1/8 or a 10th of the size of the TVs we watch now. But everybody's watching all through the day. There were a lot of firsts that day. A couple of the big firsts that day was John Glenn was the first American to eat in space. So here was what was on his menu: applesauce, pureed beef, and vegetables. It was a big deal. The scientists didn't know if humans would be able to digest food in weightlessness. So that was something that was being monitored very closely. We also have the first American to take a picture in space. NASA didn't believe in pictures in the early flight. They didn't think it was, it would help their mission. It would distract the astronaut. So John Glenn goes to the drugstore and buys his own camera for $45 and takes this picture. And that camera, of course, is on display at the John and Annie Glenn Museum. One of the most famous things, quotes from the John Glenn's flight, is this: Zero G and I feel fine. Zero G and I feel fine, he says. But the entire mission, yeah, it wasn't all hunky-dory. There were some critical moments in John Glenn's flight. But here on Earth, we didn't really know how dangerous the situation was. Mission Control could see a flashing light that was indicating that there was a problem with the heat shield. If that heat shield had come detached from the capsule, both the capsule and John Glenn would have been incinerated. There were men at Mission Controls that were crying because they thought we were going to lose John Glenn. Luckily, things didn't turn out that way. John Glenn splashes down in Friendship 7 and about 600 miles southeast of Cape Kennedy and is rescued by this destroyer. I never thought too much about this destroyer until several years ago. I was giving a presentation at a nearby memory care facility, and one of the women called me over to her wheelchair and said to me, very teary-eyed, she said to me, "My brother was a sailor aboard the Noah destroyer that picked up John Glenn." And that made such an impression on me because all I could think of was, well, first of all, how this historic event was really owned by every American, maybe not firsthand, but maybe a little bit secondhand, like this lady is. This is part of her, it's not just her memory, it could be maybe one of the last intact memories that she would ever had. And again, I thought that was a really touching moment and verified the success of this event, the importance of the event. Look at this. Every single state in the United States had some sort of celebratory event in honor of John Glenn. Here you see the big ticker tape parade down Broadway where over 3,000 tons of ticker tape is rained down. There's 4 million people show up on March 1st to welcome back John Glenn. And it's not just the public that gave John Glenn the stamp of approval, it was the United States government. Now, today this would not be a big deal. Today we've got texting and email, and the US mail just isn't what it used to be. But back in 1962, the Postal Department was vibrantly alive, and even more so thanks to FDR and Eisenhower, who were avid stamp collectors. Stamp collecting had become the #1 hobby across the United States. It was announced very shortly after John Glenn splashed down that a new postage stamp was coming out. It had never been done before to issue a stamp without forewarning. Before the end of the day, 10 million of these stamps had been purchased by Americans as just another example of the national pride. This is important enough in history to be included in, of course, the John and Annie Glenn Museum has a huge exhibit and story about the mania that came due to this new stamp being released. And it's mentioned in the US Postal Museum, the National Postage Museum in Washington, D.C. And I think maybe my most treasured earthly possession, material possession, is my John Glenn first day of issue that shows my little 3rd grade writing there. And I remember how proud I was when I finally got that in the mail. It was just a whole big thing. Certainly the flight of Mercury 7 rocked the world, but it was the second flight of John Glenn that shocked the world. He's 77 years old. He's never given up his dream of returning to space, even though he finally realizes that he's not going to get back into the rotation with NASA. So he goes on and he does all these great other things. And when he comes up with this plan, and I think again, God helps those who help themselves. I don't know what his thought process was, but he's thinking, you know, I'm getting to be a pretty old man and I really want to go back to space. And maybe I could go back to space and say, I'll be a guinea pig and try to help find out what the cause is of some of these old people diseases. And he suggests this, and it's approved. And oh my gosh, I remember when I heard him announce this, it's like, no way, this can't be John Glenn. They're talking about his son, John David Glenn. But it wasn't, it was John Glenn, and he's interviewed. And one of the things they ask him is, why are you even thinking about doing it? And he says, I've always wanted to. He says, just because I'm 77 doesn't mean I don't have a dream. So here he's teaching us a lesson. You got to have a dream. You got to plan for the future. That makes us want to get up every morning. So STS-95 goes off in 1998, and there he is, not looking quite as handsome as he once did, but still a good-looking guy, and he does all these cool things. And it's a very successful flight, probably for a number of reasons. Number one, interest in the space program had been waning. Now we got a lot of people watching. It certainly was a boost to NASA and the space program. We have, it becomes an intergenerational activity, and it's also inspiring a lot of aging baby boomers who now we're starting to say, oh man, I don't think I can do that. And now they're saying, maybe I can do that. If John Glenn can go in space at 77, I can do that at my age. For just until last year, John Glenn was the oldest person ever to have gone into space. Of course, recently we've had somebody 82 and 90, but his record stood for a long time. Another thing that was really cool about John Glenn's second flight was that he brought back a whole lot of memories from our youth and a whole lot of faces from our youth, not looking as youthful as they once did. The one on the left there, you'll remember, was the voice of the early space programs. It wouldn't have been the same without his authoritative voice. Walter Cronkite was called back to cover the launch. It was pretty cool. And in the middle there, remember his wingman in World War II, baseball slugger Ted Williams at age 80. And Ted Williams asked John Glenn for his autograph. Ted Williams had already been in the Hall of Fame for like 32 years by the time John Glenn takes off again. And that last gentleman there was John Glenn's backup pilot for his first flight, Scott Carpenter. It was also really Scott Carpenter that was John Glenn's closest astronaut friend. So he's called back, and he's called back so he can say when the rocket is lifting off the pad, Godspeed, Jann Glove. This time, Jann Glove actually hears it. Another thing that's said, NASA has a lot of traditions. We had to have Jann Glove say once again, 0G, and I feel fine. It's not nearly as fuzzy by then because of the improved technology. And we also have Annie definitely saying, I'm really worried. And Jann Glove said, don't worry. I'm only going to go to the corner store to buy a pack of gum. And she says, don't be long. Also have another ticker tape parade. Ticker tape, very few people get 2 ticker tape parades. I think it said 9 individual people have gotten multiple ticker tape parades, Jann Glove being one of them. It didn't amount to the millions then, it was the tens of thousands, but still just the honor of having a ticker tape parade. Let's talk a bit about the Kennedy connection. NASA was created, and all 7 first astronauts were selected under the Eisenhower administration. But it's President Kennedy that really ignites the public and gets us involved in the space race and space main.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
So John Kennedy goes to Cape Canaveral several times, meets the astronauts. He knows all their names. He talks to them all, but he actually becomes friends with John Glenn. John and Annie Glenn have supper with and hang out with the president and first lady on several occasions. They become close friends. And this, sadly enough, evidence of this is when John Glenn is the only astronaut that's invited to the funeral of President Kennedy when he's assassinated. And there's two books that really cover this very well, very recent books, Mercury Rising, which came out last year, and also American Moonshot, especially Mercury Rising. Great books to read, available here at Jog Library. Also, after so many years of believing that it was NASA who kept him out of the rotation, the flight rotation. After many years, finally, John Glenn is reading a biography of JFK written by Richard Reeves. And in that book, it says that it's John Kennedy that makes that decision and doesn't want John Glenn returning to space because of the fact that it would be of the public outcry should something happen that would injure or at worst kill Americans' favorite icon at that point. It's not John Kennedy, but Robert Kennedy that has the closest connection with John Glenn. It's Robert Kennedy that first suggests to John Glenn, maybe you should be a statesman. John Glenn becomes one of the lead campaigners for Robert Kennedy during his push for the presidency in 1968. And it's also Robert Kennedy that is one of the 13 pallbearers for, John Glenn is one of the pallbearers for RFK once he gets assassinated. Robert Kennedy is assassinated, and Ethel Kennedy very soon afterwards goes to John Glenn who's at the same hotel because he was part of the campaign. And Ethel Kennedy asks John and Annie if they will take the 5 younger Kennedy children back to Virginia and take care of them until Ethel can get home. And so John had the terrible job of having to break the news to the children of what happened to their dad. Not only was John Glenn a pallbearer for Robert Kennedy's funeral, but he also was the one that folded the flag and presented the flag to Ethel Kennedy on her husband's death. So John Glenn does become a statesman following his years as an astronaut, but he's never really he doesn't really have the right stuff as a statesman. He can't be that bad because he's reelected numerous times. He is the longest serving senator in the state of Ohio, goes for 24 years. And one of the things that he does when he is the senator involves our sports team. I wanted to pick something that wasn't too political. You remember back in the mid-90s, especially if you're from this area, that there was a certain Art Modell that stole our football team and took it away to another city. Well, John Glenn just never had so much communication with people that had never had any dealings with the government were saying, you've got to stop this, you got to do something about this. So John Glenn gets together what was known as the Sports Fan Rights Act, which doesn't pass, but if it had, it would have forced owners to consult fans before any type of thing like this would happen again, and the teams wouldn't be bouncing around from city to city. What it did do was it gave a whole new constituency of to John Glenn, of people, again, that were really saying, you know, I don't really care what John Glenn's platform is. I'm just going to vote for John Glenn. And I know that's what I did. One of the things that was interesting about John Glenn was that he had the capacity to accept something that wasn't quite right and turn it around. Even John Glenn worshiper Walter Cronkite referred to John Glenn's speeches as being dull. And so he wasn't a good orator, even though back in the 60s when he was a first astronaut, everything he said, every word, every sentence, everything was music to our ear. But he's not a good political speaker. And he says, you know, he says, my son is an anesthesiologist. He puts people to sleep. And you know what they say, like father, like son. When John Glenn runs for presidency, he does pretty much the same thing. He says, you know, it's not really my fault it's Annie's fault. You know, this campaign didn't turn out the way I hoped it would, but it was all Annie's fault. For years, Annie told me she wanted me to run for president in the worst way possible. And that's exactly what I did. I just love Jann Glove. He's a nice guy. Here you see him in 2012, winning yet another award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He got so many honors in his life. He lived a life of adventure and love and all sorts of awards. And he will be long remembered, even as much as there's so many things around with his name on it. First and foremost, in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a whole gaggle of men that are turning 60 years old that are named Jann Glove. And a couple of them were named Orbit because these were babies that were born immediately following his historic launch. I don't know if that's them, that's just a random picture. We had things like a fireboat named Jann Glove. We had all kinds of streets and lanes and highways and byways named Jann Glove. We have schools, lots of schools named Jann Glove, Jann Glove High School at New Concord. We had Jann Glove Elementary School over in Seven Hills. I think in total, there's like 24 schools in the United States named Jann Glove. And we also have, whoops, there's all kinds of weird things happening down here on my computer. Most importantly, Jann Glove's College of Public Affairs on Ohio State campus. If you've been around the Cleveland area long enough, you'll probably remember that that research center out near Cleveland Hopkins was formerly called Lewis Research Center. It was named Lewis Research Center for about 50 years, but it eventually became Glenn Research Center in honor of Jann Glove on March 1st, 1999. That's how long it's been Glenn Research Center. And that once very tiny airport down in Columbus that started up in 1929 became Jann Glove International Airport less than 6 months before Jann Glove passed away. And he was actually at that ceremony. He didn't want people seeing him in a wheelchair, so he struggled to walk with a cane. But yeah, Jann Glove International Airport. It was such a sad day, the day that Jann Glove passed. It was breaking news. Almost immediately across the nation, flags were lowered. His memorial service is actually on December 17th, at which time now President, then Vice President Biden gave the eulogy and described Jann Glove as being the greatest of the greatest generation. For closing remarks, instead of closing remarks, I thought I'd read to you a portion of my journal entry from the night of December 8th, 2016. Dear Jann Glove, you were my first love. It was a clear-cut case of love at first flight. When I saw you introduced on television as one of America's first astronauts, I was starstruck. Right then and there, I decided that I would become an astronaut too. I began to plan for our future. We would meet, rendezvous in space, and live happily ever after in zero G. We had so much in common. We were both born in Ohio, and our first names both started with the same letter, J. Soon, I would alter the spelling of my name to more closely match yours, ending Jann with 2 N's instead of just 1. I was certain that that particular thing would draw us even closer together. It is a well-known fact that one never forgets their first love, and I certainly have never and will never forget you. Every February 20th, I reflect on that day so long ago when you waved at me and then orbited the Earth 3 times. Godspeed, Jann Glove. Thanks for listening and honoring this great man. Now I'm going to go.
Thank you, Jann. That was great.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting. So, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I'm trying to get everybody's picture. Show video paddle.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome. Thank you for coming.
So
this
much.
evening.
Thank you, Jan.
Such thorough scholarship. The work you put into this, it's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a labor of love. Lots of reading.
I think much of that is special knowledge. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.